There is a spin-off on this parable that Jack Shea shared at a conference many years ago, a Catholic version that begins with a priest and a deacon kneeling around the altar praying together. And the priest says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." And the deacon prays, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." And then both hear a voice coming from the back of the church, and they turn to see the janitor, head bowed low, beating his breast, saying, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." And the priest turns to the deacon and haughtily remarks, "Ha! Look who thinks he's a sinner." What this clever parody brings to light is our tendency to compare ourselves with others and to measure our worth, like the Pharisee, only in terms of being less than or more than others. But before we get all squinty-eyed and declare the Pharisee the bad guy, we need to recognize that the original hearers of this parable found nothing even remotely surprising about it until Jesus got to the end and said that it was the tax collector and not the Pharisee who went home justified. That is the only part that would have drawn a gasp from the crowd. To first century ears, the Pharisee was simply praying. Scholars suggest that the prayer that Jesus places onto the Pharisee's lips was not a caricature or a distortion, but rather was a standard Jewish prayer of thanksgiving of that era. To the first hearers of this parable, the Pharisee's prayer was ordinary, as familiar as "Now I lay me down to sleep," or "Our Father who art in heaven" is to most of us. What we find distasteful is not necessarily the Pharisee's prayer, but rather the underlying spirit of the prayer, namely his smallness in comparing his piety and accomplishments to the tax collector, who he obviously considers well below himself. But it's good to note here too that we can't stay where the tax collector is in this parable either. Living our whole life with the mantra, "I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a great big sewer," is not good for us either. Jesus with this parable is certainly not recommending that the stance of self-shaming penitent become our permanent spiritual posture either. Both men are extremes. Humility is tricky. There is something of the Pharisee in all of us, as we so easily make comparisons, exalting ourselves over others. There is also something of the tax collector in all of us, who intensely recognize our own weakness and open ourselves up to the source of all mercy. What Jesus is inviting us to do is leave aside all comparisons and to seek oneness with our Creator. From this connection comes right relationship with God, others, and ourselves. Ultimately, our calling in life, what brings us fulfillment and joy, is to be spiritually free and healthy enough to use our God-given gifts to bless others, to share and love recklessly, contributing with abandon to the common good of all. This is what we were designed for. We certainly can't access this kind of openness and generosity if we are arrogant like the Pharisee, but neither can we do it if we remain habitually mired in a sense of our own unworthiness like the tax collector. The key is to always remind ourselves that all we have, all our goodness, talents, and things that we can be thankful for and take a healthy pride in, are fruits of God's grace at work in us. We are a good creation, designed by a compassionate God for a noble and loving purpose. It's not arrogant or wrong to say that we are God's gift to the world if we recognize that we are but the instrument, not the source. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, quote, "There is deep down within us all an instinct. It is a kind of drum major instinct, a desire to be out front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be first. We all want to be important, to achieve distinction. We like to do good things and we like to be praised for it, but there comes a time when the drum major instinct can become destructive. Nations are caught up with the drum major instinct. I must be first. I must be supreme. Our nation must rule the world." And he says, but let me rush on to my conclusion. Don't give this up. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. End quote. Many of us would say that the Pharisee, and maybe even Martin Luther King Jr. here, had a big ego. For most of us, the word ego has a negative connotation. To accuse someone of having a big ego is to accuse him of being overfull of himself, inflated, grandiose, and lacking in humility. But Father Ron Rolheiser declares that this is really very untrue. To have a strong, sizable ego isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a needed thing, especially if we are ever to achieve all that God dreams us to be and become as individuals and as a species. Few people would ever think of humble, stooped over little Mother Teresa as having a big ego. Yet clearly she had a huge ego, a powerful self-image that allowed her to stand before the whole world, convinced of her truth, convinced of her importance, convinced of her big dreams. It takes a powerful ego to do that. Her strong ego was key to her greatness. And yet she was humble. She was aware that everything that made her unique and powerful did not come from her, but from God. She was simply a channel of God's power and God's grace. She was never full of herself, only full of God. She could access greatness and let it flow through her without apology, but she didn't identify with that greatness or claim it as her own. For so many of us, the bigger struggle in our lives is that we have lost our rootedness in our foundational relationship with God. We are branches that have somehow disconnected from the vine, leaving us isolated and bitter. Our egos too weak to reach out to others or to do anything. In truth, the Pharisee's prayer exposes a deep insecurity, not confidence in his identity as a child of God. We all have many internal and perhaps even some external voices that habitually paralyze us with the words, "Who do you think you are? That's just pride and arrogance. That's just ego. You aren't talented enough or good enough to do this." And these voices are not of God. So perhaps the more pronounced struggle in our culture today is to strengthen our egos, rooting them squarely in the vine of God's boundless love for us, so as to allow us to be vulnerable, to be open to others, to forgive, and to resist becoming paranoid, guarded, and isolated. So if today we search ourselves and we find that our egos and our sense of self-worth are a bit shaky, perhaps we can rediscover our tradition's heroes in St. Francis of Assisi, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, among so many others, who model an openness and a security found in their relationship with God that allowed them to be vulnerable and allowed them to be great. In other words, they had strong egos, which allowed them to be accepting, warm, and loving to others. Our own Pope, praise be to Jesus, is a remarkable model of this openness, and he is drawing people in a powerful way. So yes, of course, we need to avoid pride and arrogance, and certainly refrain from comparing ourselves to others. But we also need to recognize that false humility might be our greater challenge, especially as Christians. Our attempts at humility may just be in reality selling ourselves short and keeping us from ever becoming our best selves as God calls us to be. Humility is tricky business. As a closing word of caution, author Paul Powell once observed, "Pride is so subtle that if we aren't careful, we'll be proud of our humility. When this happens, our goodness becomes badness. Our virtues become vices. We can easily become like the Sunday school teacher who, having told the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, said, 'Children, now let's bow our heads and thank God that we are not like the Pharisee.'"